Every single successful progressive movement in history started at the ground level and then grew up from that. Even the big government ones that look like they're top down were imitating stuff that had started at the ground level. Gar Alperovitz drops by to lay out this whole idea of how we can use on-the-ground activists to literally rebuild our society. It's brilliant. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Hey, let's spend some time with one of the great minds of our generation. Gar Alperovitz is an American historian and political economist. He served as a fellow at King's College, Cambridge. He was a founding fellow of the Harvard Institute of Politics, a founding fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution, the Lionel R. Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland. He also served as legislative director in the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, and as a special assistant to the U.S. Department of State. And he is a distinguished lecturer now with the American Historical Society and co-founded the Democracy Collaborative and co-chairs its Next System project, which is just extraordinary stuff, involved in the Pentagon Papers, the anti-war movement, right up to today. It's Professor Alperovitz. It's been a while since you and I did that song and dance together, a talk together in D.C. It seems like it's been 6 or 8 years. It's great to have you back with us and reconnect. I know we're both going to be, we're both featured speakers at Pioneers here, but great to have you back with us. Tell us about your thinking on this next political economic system.
Well, it's good to be in touch again, Tom. Thanks for having me on. Well, what we've been looking at is, in some ways, there's one level of political discussion, which is obviously all over the airwaves: who gets elected president, who gets elected to Congress. Very important in the short term and the near term. But one of the deep questions is the long trends of income distribution, climate change, wealth change, which by and large have not changed for over 30 years in the long directions, with the top 400 people have more income than the bottom 50%, 40%, depending upon where you draw the line, where the distribution of wealth is extremely concentrated and doesn't change much with the political process. As you noted, I'd run House and Senate staffs and also at high level of planning in the State Department. And the real question is, do you get trend change, or do the trends keep stable and not increasing, in fact decreasing in some areas? Well, that's a systemic problem. Something is really wrong at the heart of the system, and the work we've been doing here is to examine that without getting totally away from rhetoric, but what's going on with the big institutions. And one of those I would say, and I'll just put this in and we can then take it off from there, all over the Western world, progressive politics has depended overwhelmingly on having a strong labor union part of the progressive politics. In some countries, in Sweden, for instance, which many people think was the most advanced system called the welfare state, it's up to 80 or 85% of the labor force was unionized, and that gave great power to a progressive political party. In the United States, it never got over 34%, and that was way back in the 1930s. We are now down to 6% of the labor force organized in unions, and the importance of that is not only economic, but it is a very, very weakening of the traditional sources of power for progressive politics. That system, the American system, and all over the world, the welfare state systems, which depended upon corporations and obviously modern capitalism, but also the countervailing power, not only economically, but politically, that was given by labor unions, that's just about over. So we're entering really what some kind of different systemic change is about to be emerging as we go into the next decades. And it's not going to be like the past decades. We can talk about some of the signs on the ground, but that's the context into which we really have to face some real big changes that are going on, and I think are going to be dominating the next 20 years of American politics.
Yeah, it seems like, at the very least, the wealth inequalities could be addressed by simply rolling back the Trump, Bush, and Reagan tax cuts and going back to tax levels that worked so well from 1940 to 1980, you know, between 90 and 74% on the very top end. We had people getting rich, but they weren't, you know, like Mark Zuckerberg rich. But they were doing just fine, thank you very much. I mean, they could still buy a yacht and 5 houses. And we had a strong social safety net. We built the country. Eisenhower built the interstate highway system with a 91% top income tax rate, which he championed and which he defended on multiple occasions. It's just like, you know, we've been in this 40-year Reaganomics experiment, and it looks to me like it's just a disaster for us. And then if we had that money from those taxes, we could implement the Green New Deal and rebuild America the way Eisenhower did in 1954. I forget the third point you made. I'm sorry, I should have made a note. But those are at least 2 of them that would be addressed by one single policy. Or am I being too Pollyannish or simplistic here?
Well, that's the era I worked in the House and the Senate and in the policy planning area of the State Department. And indeed, that was possible. And the basic the formula that allowed those things to happen, and I certainly support what you just said, Tom, but that was kind of a progressive politics. But if you look at there's a lot of scholarly work on this now, the underpinnings of that politics, the institutional underpinnings of that politics in every country, Western country of the world, was a strong labor union base that gave power to the progressive side of the political spectrum. Right. You know, in Sweden, that was 85% of the labor force was organized in unions, and they made for a very strong, progressive, social democratic party. In Great Britain,
so we're lacking that here, as you so eloquently laid out. On the other hand, we're seeing enormous grassroots activism in the United States right now, largely from communities that have been at least politically marginalized in the past, communities of color, young people, people on Social Security, people with college debt, things like that. Many of them, you know, typically never even voted. Now they're out in the streets. Can they make up for the death of the labor unions or from Reagan killing the labor unions in the United States with that on-the-ground activism and electing, you know, good progressives like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, those kind of folks?
Well, I think that's a really good question, Tom, and I'm glad you raised it. And indeed, that's the world I come out of. The answer is yes, but not enough. Wherever we can get that kind of activism, it's very important. But the other piece of it, and this is what's interesting about what's happening on the ground, just kind of under the radar, is unions were an institution that worked hand in hand with the kind of activism you're talking about, and indeed helped finance it and gave power to it and lobbied in Washington, and they had ongoing institutional muscle. That world is just about over, and most people don't realize it. The question of building a real progressive movement of the kind that we're talking about and we both hope for, I think is going to rest on what's happening just under the radar, where new kinds of community economic institutions have in fact been developing all over the country. It's kind of like, if you look back at the 1920s, before the Great Depression and before the New Deal, almost everything that became the New Deal was developing on the ground around in the states and localities, and then kind of became nationalized under Roosevelt. And what we're seeing around the country are lots and lots of really interesting experiments that I think are the necessary condition and likely to lay the groundwork for the next transformative move in American politics. That's long-term, decade-by-decade building, but I can give you some examples of really interesting things that are going on that I think are already laying foundations here and in countries like Great Britain and in other countries that the people who've been studying it closely on the ground, the national press doesn't pick it up, but there's a lot of research of what's really happening and laying groundwork for the next big New Deal, if you like.
Well, Gar, before we dig into those on-the-ground solutions, I'd like to do that in about 4 minutes, but you have referenced state and local laboratories of democracy. This is a phrase that in some ways goes back to the founding of the country, or at least the sentiment does. Can you expand on that?
Well, the term was most widely used in the late 1920s and the 1930s, where things like what became the welfare programs in the welfare state and Social Security, for instance, were experimented with in states like California, particularly California, and also Oregon, and then became the kind of models upon which new legislation at the national level were developed. So that's the most salient feature. Public banks, if you look around the country now, are an interesting model that's developing in different parts of the country. The most advanced one is in North Dakota, which is a state-owned bank which helps finance local community cooperatives and worker-owned companies and farmers. But it's a public bank, and it's conventional, developing a
That's
different
been there for
model.
100 years. Why have no other states picked one up?
Well, it's very interesting that that model hasn't been picked up, but it certainly is now. Many, many states have looked at it. I think what happened was the New Deal, and I think this is a good example of what the dynamics of the politics. There was a strong enough labor movement during the New Deal to give undergirding power to a progressive politics of the kind we know, which is a major corporate capitalist country like our own or like most of the Western Europeans, but counterbalanced, or the term they use is countervailed, by a progressive politics at the heart of which was labor union political power. So you didn't need all these other institutions like public banks and other things happening, and I can tell you about lots else on the ground, because you had a different kind of design of the system, the big corporations, but balanced politically as well as economically, in part by labor union power. That's over. That game is over. The labor unions are just about gone in this country, so we're now seeing the development in many, many parts of the country of new institutions that begin to build a different power base for a new kind of politics of a more progressive kind to counterbalance the weight of corporate politics. And I think that's where
are you talking about groups like Indivisible or like the Democracy Collaborative, or is there something I'm missing?
Yeah, those are some. Those are advocacy groups or research groups like our own at the Democracy Collaborative. Let me give you an example, and I'll give you one in England and one here. But in the United States, in Cleveland, there's a group of community worker-owned companies, very large scale, that are in a kind of a neighborhood of about 40,000, very low income, mostly black, and there is a community-wide community-owned corporation, jointly owned with workers in large scale. There's a laundry. There's a very high-tech environmental greenhouse. There's a business that does environmental and electronic work and electrical work, solar installations, etc. So it's a jointly nonprofit community-wide corporation benefiting the whole community, 40,000 neighborhood, but jointly with the worker-owned companies. That's a new institutional base.
I'm talking with Gar Alperovitz, whose resume is just breathtaking, and we've got a lot of territory to cover here in this hour. But Gar, you said you had some examples where these laboratories of democracy, as it were, communities, states, neighborhoods, were creating some of the new institutions that could bring us forward and help rebuild our nation from the neoliberal damage of the last 40 years or so. My phrase, not yours. Tell us about those.
Well, I think that the essence of them is some sort of democratization of wealth, if you like, or of ownership. And I was mentioning some of these co-ops would be the thing that most people know about, or credit unions or democratic banks. Co-ops are democratic companies. But we're seeing very interesting complexes of them. And I mentioned the one in Cleveland, which is worker-owned companies, which are jointly owned with a nonprofit corporation covering about 40,000 people in a poor neighborhood there. We've worked closely with people in Preston, England, where they're doing it in a much larger community, a community-wide nonprofit corporation or a municipality, setting up a community bank, setting up community-owned jobs and joint ventures with cooperatives. So all of a sudden you begin changing the day-to-day complex of what the structure of work looks like and who owns it. You know, the concentration of wealth in the United States is extraordinary. The top 4 or 5 people, the very wealthiest, own more wealth than the bottom 40 or 50%, depending on how you do the calculations. So changing who owns wealth is a big part of this. Another piece of it is, for environmentalists, is very important. Also, land trusts, which begin to take some of the land under community or nonprofit control, and there are lots of that going on. Lots of community bank development, public banks. The oldest one is in North Dakota. It's about 100 years old, conservative state. You might call it a socialist bank, but it's a very conservative state and very popular amongst the business people there. We're seeing a lot of experimentation with public banks. All of this is like the 1920s, as I said, and where all the experiments that were taking place in the 1920s were later expanded to become the politics of the New Deal in much larger form. And I think we're in that kind of a period now in terms of experimentation. It's also important to remember, if you look at what at the national level, and most people haven't noticed this, we are doing things that are radical in the financial world. Under the current Federal Reserve Board, we have put trillions of dollars created into the system by the Federal Reserve Board, which is, most people don't understand the way money manufacture works, but it's like a wartime. All of a sudden, when you want to do it, the institutions can create financial credit, which is what's happening right now, big time, and it happened in World War II, big time, but this is under the Trump era. So using the power of the Federal Reserve Board, which is a national bank, to actually finance some of these new experiments is a big part of the next stage. So there's a lot going on. I can give you one or two more examples, then we can take it off from there. People tend to forget just, almost 10 years ago, we nationalized General Motors, Chrysler Corporation, some of the big banks during the Great Recession. So crisis moments, all of a sudden, some of the big ones begin to change, and then they were sold back in part to the workers and part to the companies. But we may see developments like in the 1930s, one of the big corporations that became public was the Tennessee Valley Authority, which still exists, a very, very large 7-state kind of enterprise, which is both generates electricity but has ecological implications. It's a quasi-public entity. So I think we're in a period now where we're laying groundwork, a lot of experimentation just under the radar, which the press doesn't cover, which I think is beginning to filter itself into politics at the local level. And I think we're going to see a very exciting period building on all of this grassroots experimentation that's going on, as I say, just below the radar of most public attention.
You know, Reagan declared war on unions 2 years after Maggie Thatcher's essentially first major act of office was to take on the most powerful union in England, the coal miners, and broke their backs. And then Reagan did the same thing with PATCO. Are the UK and the United States the only two countries in the Western world that have diminished the power of labor radically?
Well, it's been declined radically. I mean, the Brits, I think, are still at about 28% of the labor force. We're only at 6% in the private sector, so we're way, way down at the bottom.
Germany is like 80, 90%.
I think it's not quite that high, but it is very high. Sweden is still up in that range. So they have strong, and then the point which is critical is that labor, not just, most people think about labor unions in, bargaining for wages and hours and working conditions. Yes, that's very important. But the other part of it is they typically finance and give muscle and manpower and woman power to politics for the progressive side of the spectrum. And that's a big deal. It's been well studied by political scientists. When you have small labor unions, you have weak progressive politics, unless you build new institutions, which is what we're talking about.
Gar Alperovitz on the line with us for the hour. Gar, back in the day, U.S. Steel was moving their factory out of, as I recall, Pittsburgh, and you were involved in trying to... Youngstown, that's right, thank you. Can you tell us about that experience and what you learned from it?
Yes, it was Youngstown Sheet and Tube was the name of the company when it shut down, and about 5,000 workers lost their job on one terrible day in September 1976, I think it was. And all of a sudden, the community of Youngstown realized the biggest base of their enterprise was gone. So the community got together, both the workers and the city council and the church leadership, and they wanted to do something to save jobs, to save lives, save the community. And they called me, and I was working on economic things in Washington, and they'd sort of looked at some of the experiments we've been involved with, and jointly we developed a plan for worker and community ownership of a giant steel mill, and to put it back and modernize it and put it back up and running. And the Carter administration at that time financed the big, very professional studies of how to do it. but the most important part was the political organizing that got the whole state of Ohio and the National Council of Churches, the Republican governor of Ohio, a big backing for this plan to put the company back on. And around the country, in many parts of the country, the idea of community worker ownership was very widely popularized by this effort. What happened was the Carter administration at the last moment decided not to go forward. We think that we now know that some of the big steel companies had gotten to them, and even some of the hierarchy at that time of the steel labor unions, they've changed radically now. The modern guys are very different and very progressive. Got to them and said they didn't want to do this. So that the actual plan, which was done by the leading technology guys in the steel industry for a community worker-owned company, didn't happen. But what did happen, and this is the story to think about, throughout the state of Ohio, that idea has spread. So you find worker cooperatives everywhere in Ohio. In Cleveland, there's a whole complex in the Cleveland, one of the very poor neighborhoods. It's a community-wide corporation with joint ventures with worker-owned companies and with the hospitals and universities buying from this in the Cleveland area. And many parts of the country and in Great Britain have picked up on the model that spun out of this early progress in Youngstown. And the model and the moral of the story is a lot of the experimentation going on now around the country. We've begun to talk about that. Cooperatives, public banks, new land ownership, municipal and neighborhood ownership, land trusts, regional efforts. These experiments, just as in the 1920s, these experiments laid the groundwork for what became nationally the New Deal. We think we're going to see a lot more and more building on the experiments now happening of the kind that are even more interesting in communities around the country, and public banks and worker-owned companies, community-owned companies that are just popping up beneath the surface, and I think are laying groundwork for something very exciting. The other thing that's really happening, that just to open the door on this, in 2 or 3 of the really giant states, California is now, I think, the 5th largest economy in the world. You're seeing even more experimentation in almost nation-state scale. The United States is a gigantic continent, and it's very hard to run a participatory democracy in a continent 3,000 miles coast to coast diagonally. But some of the states, like California, are really experimenting with public banks, with ownership, with new environmental efforts, with new politics. And we may certainly see New York doing the same thing. And Texas is just about to turn as the Hispanic community becomes a majority of the politics, with the minority politics in Texas. We're going to see some of these big states, I think, taking on the kind of things that are almost as big, or you can drop Germany into Montana, these little countries in Europe. I think we're going to see some of our big regional-sized states taking up where the federal government is not able to act, and I think that's going to be very positive for the future. So even though there's some real difficulties at the national level, I think we're building from the ground up, and in some of the key states, lots and lots of interesting and exciting experimentation for the future.
Are you seeing new models beyond the things that you've talked about that are emerging? And to that point, by the way, and to the point of all of this, it seems like whenever there is anything going on, for example, here in Oregon a couple of years ago, the Democrats in the legislature, who controlled the legislature, proposed cap and trade for carbon emissions. You know, a nice step. It's an old George Herbert Walker Bush thing. It's how he did away with sulfur dioxide acid rain, was with a cap and trade program. It used to be a Republican idea. Democrats proposed that here, and what happened? We had local right-wing talk show hosts going hysterical, supporting the Republicans, and of course a lot of right-wing radio around the country is subsidized or supported by the Koch network, by the Heritage Foundation. Ken Vogel did some great in-depth reporting on this. You know, $9 million the Heritage Foundation gave to Rush Limbaugh, millions they give to Hannity. There's this huge right-wing echo chamber of 1,500 radio stations, you know, just saturating the country in the spittle of Limbaugh and these guys every day. And then on top of that, you got Fox News, and you've got all these right-wing publications, and now they're basically taking over the internet by creating dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations and phony news groups that show up on, you know, any kind of Google search. Google search just organized labor, and many of the first links that come up are about corruption and evil and all this kind of stuff. How do we accomplish this in this environment where the billionaires have been given such power to involve themselves in our politics by the Supreme Court, principally by the Buckley and Bellotti decisions in 76, 78, and then ratified in 2010 by Citizens United?
Well, it's, as putting on a historian's hat, the way it's always done, of course, you and I talked about this a long time ago, Tom, building from the bottom up to build a new power base. But also, I sort of think about it this way, and this term is caught on in some discussions. If you think of the country, not in the way we usually do, but think of it as a checkerboard. There are certain states, California being one, maybe Oregon now, New York State, my home state of Wisconsin, where I'm from originally, several other states where you could see really interesting experimentation, building up a different kind of institutional, like these public banks and community ownership and worker ownership, municipalizing cable systems, lots of experimentation all over the country on the checkerboard. Now, if you think of it as building piece by piece across the checkerboard rather than are we a majority now, you get one picture. But if you think of this building slowly as it did in the 1920s and the 1930s and in the period before the World War I, that's the way you get to the place where you can have enough national power to make things happen. And that's the exciting thing about what's happening just under the surface with community land ownership. Land trusts are very common. Public utilities are growing. Community worker-owned companies are growing. Public banks are growing. New environmental programs on the checkerboard part of the country. So as I see it as a historian, is an extremely fertile and creative period, even though at the national level, the power relationships you're talking about and the very conservative issues are still dominant in some parts of the country. There's something brewing, as they say, that is not just political. It's building new institutions to replace, in some ways, what the labor unions once did for progressive politics in America and virtually all the Western countries. So that process of slowly reconstructing new forms of democratic ownership at the bottom up is a very fertile and exciting process. If you're willing to play the long game, which I think is the only game we can play right now, do whatever can be done at one level, at the national level, state level, but also really rebuilding not only movement politics, but these new exciting institutions of community banks, worker banks, land trusts, worker community ownership, state ownership, a whole set of structures that countervail against the other giant corporate structures, is the slow process of rebuilding a very, very different foundations, infrastructure for what we call the next system, which is well beyond either capitalism or socialism, very decentralized, very American, but has much more public and democratic ownership aspects.
We have about 20 seconds to the break. How does the average person tap into this? How do people join this movement, as it were?
Well, the Democracy Collaborative, which is our institution, we have lots and lots of publications. My co-chair on the Next System Project, Gus Beth, has just published a book called New Systems, and it's a compilation of this, which is available right now on the web.